one of the primary images of Christianity in the New Testament is this idea of flesh versus spirit. And Paul talks about that a lot, and he does a lot of great theology on that. Who better to help us to understand the realities of that than persons who are living with disabilities? Because for them, it's not just an idea. I literally live with things that my brain sometimes does in my body that I don't want it to do. And what I tell people is my faith often has to lead a rebellion against my body, because sometimes my brain, whether it's extreme sensory processing, if I get into a situation where my brain is overloaded sensory wise, I can spend the next 2 days in bed. But I also have to have the faith to know that, that's not something that can totally control and define my life. And so there are a lot of persons in the disability community, whether it's intellectual, physical, or developmental, who have that as a real challenge. It's not just ideology, but it brings such a vibrancy to understanding God in a different way and theology in a different way, because it's not just something that we talk about. We actually have to live every day with this contest between our faith and our spirit and our bodies. And Paul does such a beautiful job of talking about that, primarily because I believe that Paul also had a disability. He talks about his thorn. In Galatians, he references the fact that he stopped in that province of Galatia, not because he chose to, but because his body made a decision for him. And he goes on to say that some of them were so kind to him that they would have given him their eyes, if they could have, which is a nod to the fact that he was going blind. Some of the early church fathers were actually persons with disabilities. Even our understanding of the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity, first came from a church father who actually happened to be blind. So there's a lot of ways that people with disabilities experience the world and faith in God in ways that are not necessarily typical. But when there's space allowed for that, it creates a much healthier and vibrant theology of who God is, and how we experience life. And I think it just adds to our understanding of how to properly understand the character and the nature of God and all these other doctrines that we hold so dear. We get a fuller picture of that when we allow persons with disabilities to add to that conversation.
And I got to say, I stopped in my tracks when I was reading your book, when I came upon the section where you talk about a disabled God.
Mm.
And I'm wondering if you talk about that. That is such a powerful phrase. I had to stop right there and underline it. And I wonder if you can kind of unpack that.
Yeah, so I was carrying on some of the great work for those who are not familiar with her, the late Nancy Eastland, who was a professor at Canada School of Theology at Emory University, where I got my Master of Divinity. And she herself was disabled. She wrote a book actually called The Disabled God. I quote a couple of her chapters in there, just really picking up on that work. So that derives from something that I think that we don't often really think about, because I think most of us who grew up in the church have been taught a sanitized Sunday school version of the crucifixion. And so one of the things I talk about is what a real Roman crucifixion would have looked like. So we're starting with the premise that we believe as Christians that Jesus is God. If you look at what a real Roman crucifixion would have looked like, it would have been terribly, not just torturous, but disabling. The 9-inch spikes would have went through his wrists, which I talk about in the book, which would have torn somewhere between 7 and 8 tendons. In a real Roman crucifixion, the legs would have been turned sideways and a spike would have been driven somewhere around the Achilles tendon, which would have torn that. And I've torn my Achilles tendon. I talk about it in the book. That is not an easy injury to get over. So if Jesus does come back and his resurrected body still bears the marks of that torture, which meant they were not healed, we've got to wrestle with the fact, what does that mean for us understanding his relationship to disability? We also have to fast forward to the book of Revelation, where it talks about where John the Revelator says that he saw an image of the lamb/lion that was mortally wounded, yet standing in victory. I'm paraphrasing, which is a nod also to the fact that the way that Jesus returned, he returned with the body that was tortured and disabled without it having been healed yet. The pain and the suffering that's associated with it was no longer there. What does that say about the fact that he chose to identify himself, even to Thomas? He chose to identify himself by the disabling marks that he occurred as a result of him becoming one of us, becoming human. So a lot of Easton's work and my work says that, okay, if that's true, and we can read that in scripture, we have to wrestle with the fact that Jesus bore the marks of disability. And if he is God, then that's where the term the disabled God comes from. What I'm challenging people to think about theologically is that says a lot profoundly to God's relationship to ultimately identifying with a very marginalized group. And Jesus goes to the extreme to which he will identify with the human experience. So in that day, often it was women, orphans, the disabled, who are the most marginalized group. So between, that and anywhere in between, Jesus is able to identify to the extent he goes all the way to the extreme to be able to identify with a very marginalized group who had physical impairment. And so I think we really have to wrestle with those texts in scripture and to understand the lengths by which God allowed himself to be disabled to identify with the full breadth of the human experience. So much so that when Jesus returns back to life, he doesn't erase that. He uses that as the identifying marks to which he communicates his resurrection. So I just encourage people to really, really wrestle with that and to ask ourselves, what does that say about God?
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.